The doors of the grand hall closed behind me with a heavy sound, and I knew there was no easy way back out. Every eye in that glittering room turned toward me, the only human standing on a floor made of polished black stone that reflected the light of 3 moons through the tall windows above. I was Cale Doran, a technical advisor for the human delegation, and I had been sent to finish what months of careful talks had built. The Cadran Empire controlled trade routes across a dozen star systems, and my job was simple. Sit, listen, sign the final agreement, and bring home a future for Earth. I did not expect to be laughed at. Princess Isira Vin sat on a raised seat beside her father's empty throne, dressed in silver robes that seemed to catch every bit of light in the room. She was 19 years old, yet she carried herself like someone who had never once been told no. Her eyes were a pale violet, sharp and unblinking, and when she looked at me, I felt like an insect being studied under glass. "So this is the creature they sent," she said, her voice carrying easily across the silent hall. "I was told humans were clever. I did not expect them to also be small." A ripple of laughter moved through the nobles seated along the walls. I kept my hands folded in front of me and said nothing. I had been warned that Cadran royalty enjoyed testing outsiders before trade talks. I told myself this was simply a formality, a performance before the real conversation began. "Your Highness," I said, keeping my voice even, "I am here on behalf of the human delegation to finalize the trade agreement discussed by our representatives and yours." She rose from her seat slowly, walking down 3 steps until she stood only a few feet from me. She was taller than me by half a head, and she used that height now, tilting her chin down as she studied my face. "Do you know how long our empire has existed?" she asked. 6,000 years, and your kind discovered how to leave your own planet only a century ago. You still argue among yourselves over borders drawn by your ancestors. You still burn fuel from the ground to light your cities. And you stand here, in my father's hall, expecting to be treated as equals. I felt heat rise in my chest, but I kept my expression calm. "Every species starts somewhere, Your Highness. We are proud of how far we have come in a short time." "Proud," she repeated, and smiled without warmth. "That is almost sweet, like a child proud of building a tower out of blocks." More laughter followed, louder this time. Even the guards along the wall allowed themselves small smiles. I glanced toward the empty seat where the king should have been sitting. He had sent word that he was delayed, and in his place, his daughter had been given authority to oversee the final signing. I had assumed this meant a formality. I had not expected to be handed to someone who saw the entire negotiation as a game. "If it pleases Your Highness," I said carefully, "perhaps we could proceed with reviewing the terms. Our representatives worked for many months to reach fair conditions for both sides." "Fair," she said, tasting the word like it amused her. "You call it fair that we open our shipping lanes to a species that has not even solved hunger on its own planet. You call it fair that we share our medicine, our shields, our knowledge of travel between stars, in exchange for what? Rocks and metals you cannot even properly mine yourselves?" I stood still, feeling my own pulse in my ears. I had trained for difficult negotiations. I had prepared for hard questions about tariffs and shipping rights and resource limits. I had not prepared for a public performance meant to humiliate me in front of an audience that clearly enjoyed the show. "Tell me, human," she continued, circling me now the way a predator studies something it has already decided is beneath its effort. "Do your people know how fragile they are? One bad harvest, one solar storm, one mistake in your fragile little reactors, and how many of you would simply cease to exist? We have technology that could save your species 1,000 times over, and still you come here asking us to treat you as partners." The room was utterly silent except for her voice and the soft rustle of robes as nobles leaned forward to watch more closely. "You are like a child standing at the door of a grand library," she said, "begging to be handed the finest books when you have not yet learned to read." Somewhere in that hall, someone actually applauded, a short clapping of hands that echoed off the high ceiling. I felt many things in that moment. Anger, certainly. Embarrassment, yes. But underneath both of those, something quieter and steadier began to settle into place. Something that felt less like emotion and more like clarity. I looked at her, this young woman who had never once had to earn anything for herself, who had been handed a throne and an empire, and the assumption that everyone beneath her existed simply to be judged. "Your Highness," I said, my voice steady, "I did not come here to be mocked. I came here to build something between our peoples that could last for generations. If that is not something you are interested in, then there is nothing more for me to discuss." She raised an eyebrow, clearly expecting me to continue, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to beg for the deal to continue despite her words. Instead, I bowed my head slightly, the way custom required when leaving a royal court, and turned around. "What are you doing?" she asked, and for the first time, there was a crack of surprise in her voice. "Ending this meeting," I said, walking toward the doors. "You cannot simply leave," she said, and I heard her step forward. "This agreement took months to prepare. Your leaders sent you specifically to finish it." I stopped at the doors, but did not turn back. "My leaders sent me to negotiate with partners who respect us. I see no partners here today." "You would throw away everything your species needs," she said, her voice rising now, losing the practiced calm from before. "Over hurt feelings?" I turned then, just enough to look back at her over my shoulder. "We have survived worse than insults, Your Highness. We will survive without this deal as well." The doors opened before me, guards stepping aside with confused glances toward the throne, unsure whether to stop me or let me pass. I did not wait for permission. I walked out of that glittering hall, down the long stone steps outside the palace, past fountains carved from crystal and gardens that had taken centuries to grow, and I did not look back once. Behind me, I could hear voices rising in the hall, confusion turning quickly into alarm. I did not know yet how far this moment would travel, how many systems would eventually hear the story of a single human turning his back on an empire. I only knew that I had done what felt right, and that somewhere far above the palace, a ship was waiting to carry me home. By the time I reached the transport that would take me back to the human embassy on the outer ring of the city, my hands had finally stopped shaking. I sat alone in the small cabin, staring out at the twin suns setting behind distant towers, and I replayed her words over and over in my mind, wondering if I had just made the greatest mistake of my career, or the only choice that mattered. I did not know that within hours, the story of what happened in that hall would spread far beyond the palace walls, carried first by whispers among servants, then by nobles eager to gossip, and finally by news networks that stretched across a dozen star systems. I did not know that a 19-year-old princess, sitting alone on her throne after the doors closed, would spend that entire night staring at the empty space where I had once stood, replaying the moment again and again, trying to understand why a species she had been taught to see as beneath her had simply walked away without fear. All I knew, as my transport rose above the palace and the city lights spread out beneath me like scattered stars, was that I had said no to an empire, and that there was no way to know yet what that would cost, or what it might one day earn. The last thing I saw before the transport left the atmosphere was the palace itself, tiny now against the darkening sky, its highest tower still lit from within, where I imagined a young princess sat alone, finally beginning to understand that not everyone she looked down on would stay beneath her. I leaned back in my seat, closed my eyes, and let the quiet hum of the engines carry me toward home, toward whatever consequences waited there, and toward a future none of us could have predicted on that ordinary afternoon when I chose to turn and walk away. The news reached the human embassy before I did. By the time my transport landed on the platform outside the main building, a small crowd of staff members had already gathered, murmuring among themselves, some looking worried, others looking almost impressed. I stepped out into the cool evening air, and Grace Whitmore, the lead diplomat for our delegation, was waiting at the base of the ramp with her arms crossed and an expression I could not quite read. "Well," she said, as I approached, "you certainly gave them something to talk about." I opened my mouth to explain, to apologize, to offer some kind of defense for what I had done, but she raised a hand before I could speak. "Save it for the debrief," she said. "Right now, half the council back on Earth is either furious with you or ready to give you a medal, and I honestly cannot tell which side is winning." I followed her inside, unsure which outcome I was hoping for, unsure whether I had just ended my career or begun something none of us yet understood. The debrief room was small and windowless, lit by a single strip of soft light along the ceiling. Grace sat across from me with a datapad in her hands, scrolling through reports that had already begun pouring in from Earth. Noah Bennett, another member of our engineering team, leaned against the wall near the door, arms folded, watching me with an expression somewhere between disbelief and quiet respect. "Walk me through it again," Grace said, "from the moment you entered the hall." I told her everything, word for word as best I could remember, the comments about our fragile bodies, the mockery about our short history among the stars, the laughter from the nobles, the empty throne where the king should have been sitting. Grace listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable, until I finished. "And you just left," she said. "No warning, no request to speak with someone else. You simply turned around and walked out of the single most important negotiation this delegation has had in 3 years. "Yes," I said. She set the datapad down on the table between us and rubbed her eyes with the heel of her hand. For a long moment, nobody spoke. "You do understand," she said finally, "that this deal was supposed to give us access to their medical technology, their shielding systems, enough advanced engineering knowledge to move our own progress forward by decades." "I understand," I said. "I also understand that we would have spent the next 50 years being treated exactly the way she treated me today, every single time we needed something from them. I did not think that was a price worth paying." Noah shifted against the wall. "For what it's worth," he said, "I've sat through 3 of those preliminary meetings with their trade officials. They talked about us like we were a mildly interesting species of animal they were doing a favor by studying. I always wondered how long it would take before someone snapped." Grace shot him a look, but did not argue the point. "The Council on Earth is split," she said instead, turning her attention back to me. "Half of them are drafting statements about diplomatic failure and lost opportunity. The other half are already treating this like some kind of turning point. Apparently the story is spreading faster than we expected." "Spreading how?" I asked. She turned the datapad around so I could see the screen. It showed a feed from one of the smaller alien news networks, one that covered court gossip and political drama across several systems. The headline, translated into our language by the embassy's system, read simply, "Human walks away from Cadron Royal Court after Princess mocks his species." Beneath it, hundreds of comments were already stacking up, some from other alien species entirely, curious and amused by the story, others, clearly Cadron citizens expressing shock that anyone would dare to insult their princess by leaving her presence. "This is not what I intended," I said quietly. "I don't think it matters what you intended," Grace said. "It's already out there." Over the following days, I learned just how far a single moment could travel. Word of what happened in that hall reached other trading partners across the region, species who had their own long histories of dealing with the Cadron Empire, some resentful of years spent under one-sided agreements very similar to the one I had walked away from. A delegation from a neighboring system called the Farian Compact reached out to Earth's council within the week, requesting a private meeting. Their representatives were polite, careful, and clearly fascinated by what had happened. They wanted to know if humanity might be interested in an alternative trade relationship, one built on more balanced terms. Earth's council, still arguing internally about whether I should be reprimanded or thanked, found itself suddenly presented with an opportunity nobody had expected. What had looked like a diplomatic disaster began, slowly, to look like the opening of a door nobody knew existed. Meanwhile, far across the space between our worlds, inside the Cadron Palace, a very different kind of conversation was taking place. I did not witness what happened next myself. I learned of it later, pieced together from reports gathered by embassy staff who maintained contacts within the palace, from translated court records, and eventually, much later, from someone who had actually been present in the room. King Halvorn Ven returned to the palace 2 days after the incident, having been delayed by matters in a distant province. He arrived to find his court still buzzing with talk of what had happened in his absence, and his daughter unusually quiet, spending most of her time alone in her private chambers. He summoned her the moment he learned the details. The throne room where he received her was smaller than the grand hall where I had stood, a private chamber used for family matters rather than public court business. According to those who later spoke of it, the king did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Explain to me," he reportedly said, "how a routine trade agreement, one that took 3 years of careful work to arrange, ended with the human delegation walking out entirely." Isira, by all accounts, did not immediately answer. When she did, her voice lacked the confidence she had shown in the grand hall. "He was disrespectful," she said. "He needed to understand his place before we could proceed as equals." "His place," the king repeated. "Tell me, daughter, did this human ever raise his voice to you? Did he ever threaten you, insult you, or fail to show the proper respect expected of a visiting diplomat?" She was silent. "I have read the reports," the king continued. "He addressed you with every proper title. He waited patiently while you mocked his species in front of the entire court. He asked, more than once, if you would simply proceed with the agreement our people spent years preparing, and when you refused to treat him as anything other than an amusement, he left. He is beneath us," Isira said, though the certainty in her voice had clearly begun to waver. "His species has existed among the stars for barely a century. We have technology they cannot even imagine. And yet," the king said, "he did not need our technology to understand something you apparently do not. Respect is not measured by how advanced a species has become. It is measured by how they treat those with less power than themselves." The conversation, according to those who overheard it, continued for some time, the king explaining in detail exactly what the empire had lost. Not simply the trade agreement itself, though that alone represented years of resources and effort. He explained how word of the incident was already spreading, how other trading partners across the region were beginning to question whether dealing with the Kayadran Empire meant accepting the same treatment humanity had refused to tolerate. "You have made us look foolish," the king said, "in front of species we have spent centuries building relationships with. You have shown them that our royal court cannot manage a simple negotiation without turning it into theater for your own amusement." Isira, according to the accounts I later heard, did not argue further. She simply listened, and when her father finally dismissed her, she returned to her chambers and did not appear in public for several days. I did not know any of this at the time. I only knew that back on Earth, the mood surrounding my decision had begun to shift. What had first looked like a mistake was slowly being reframed as something else entirely, a moment where a single person had refused to accept humiliation on behalf of an entire species, and where that refusal had, unexpectedly, opened doors nobody had thought to knock on before. Grace called me into her office nearly 2 weeks after the incident, and this time her expression was different, calmer, though still cautious. "The council has made a decision," she said. "We are not pursuing further talks with the Kayadran Empire, at least not through official channels, not unless they come to us with a formal apology and revised terms." "And the Farian Compact?" I asked. "Their representatives are arranging a formal visit," she said. "They seem genuinely interested in working with us as equals, not as a species to be managed or educated." She paused, studying me carefully. "For what it's worth, whatever you meant to do in that hall, it seems to have worked out better than anyone expected." I did not feel triumphant hearing that. I mostly felt tired, and strangely aware that somewhere far away, a young woman who had never been told no in her life was perhaps beginning to understand, for the first time, that the galaxy did not automatically bend to her expectations. I had no way of knowing then how much further this story still had to travel, or that the princess who had mocked me in front of her entire court would, in time, become far more curious about the species she had so easily dismissed than either of us could have imagined on that ordinary afternoon. Rumors continued to spread in the weeks that followed, carried between star systems by traders, diplomats, and travelers who found the story too interesting not to repeat. Some versions exaggerated what had happened, claiming I had spoken boldly in front of the entire court, delivering some grand speech about human dignity before storming out. Others shrank the story down to almost nothing, a minor misunderstanding blown out of proportion by bored nobles with nothing better to discuss. The truth, as it often does, sat quietly somewhere in between, mostly forgotten by everyone except the two people who had actually stood in that hall, both of us now carrying the weight of that afternoon in very different ways. I returned to my regular work at the embassy, reviewing trade proposals from the Farian Compact and two smaller systems that had reached out following news of what happened. Life, for me, mostly returned to normal, filled with meetings and reports and the slow, careful work of building something new. I did not expect to hear anything further from the Cadran Empire, and for several months I did not. I had no idea that inside the palace, a 19-year-old princess had begun quietly studying everything she could find about humanity, watching recorded footage of our cities, our conflicts, our strange and stubborn history of surviving against odds that should have ended us many times over. I did not know that she had begun asking her father's advisors questions about human culture that none of them could fully answer, or that she had started, in small and private ways, to wonder what kind of species could walk away from an empire without a single moment of hesitation. I only knew as the months passed that the choice I made in that hall had changed something, though I could not yet see how far those changes would eventually reach, or how they would one day bring the princess and I face to face again, under circumstances neither of us could have predicted. 6 months after I walked out of that palace, I stood on the observation deck of a Farian trading vessel, watching Earth shrink behind us as we prepared to jump toward a system I had never visited before. The agreement with the Farian Compact had been finalized 2 months earlier, built on terms that treated humanity as a genuine partner rather than a species to be managed. In exchange for rare minerals mined from our own asteroid belt, they offered us access to medical technology that had already begun saving lives back home, treatments for diseases our scientists had struggled with for decades. Word of the agreement spread quickly, and with it, interest from other species who had grown tired of dealing with the Cadran Empire on unequal terms. Within a year, humanity had signed agreements with 3 separate systems, each one built on the same foundation: respect first, resources second. I found myself traveling more than I ever expected, representing the human delegation in meetings across systems I had only read about in briefing documents. I was not famous exactly, but among certain circles, particularly diplomats and traders who dealt regularly with multiple species, my name had become attached to a story that continued to grow with each retelling. Some called me the man who said no to an empire. Others simply referred to the incident itself, the day a human walked out of the Cadran court, as a kind of turning point in how other species began to view humanity. I found the attention uncomfortable most days, though Grace assured me it was proving useful in negotiations, opening doors that might otherwise have stayed closed. I did not think much about Isira during those months, or at least I told myself I did not. When her name did come up, in briefings or gossip among embassy staff, I felt an odd mixture of things I could not fully name, something between resentment and a strange, distant curiosity about what had happened to her after that day. I learned eventually that the Cadran Empire had suffered real consequences from the incident. 2 of their long-standing trade partners had quietly begun renegotiating terms, citing concerns about how the empire treated smaller or newer partners. Their reputation across the region, once built on centuries of unquestioned dominance, had developed a small but noticeable crack, one that seemed to widen slightly with each new agreement humanity signed with someone else. I did not know that the king had assigned his daughter a new duty in the aftermath, one meant both as punishment and as a genuine attempt to repair the damage her behavior had caused. I learned the details much later, from Isira herself, though at the time I only knew that a Cadran diplomatic ship had requested permission to send an observer to Earth, someone tasked with studying human culture directly rather than relying on second-hand reports and outdated assumptions. Grace brought the request to me personally, sliding a datapad across her desk with an expression that suggested she already knew how I would react. "They want to send an observer," she said, "someone to spend time among us, learn how we live, how we think, how we make decisions." Officially, it's framed as an attempt to better understand potential partners for future negotiations. "And unofficially?" I asked. "Unofficially, I suspect someone in that palace realized they badly misjudged us, and they would like to fix that before they lose any more standing among their neighbors." She paused. "The observer they want to send is Princess Isira Ven." I stared at the datapad for a long moment, feeling something twist in my chest that I could not immediately identify. "You cannot be serious," I said. "I wish I wasn't," Grace replied. "But given your history with her, and given that you're one of the few people on this staff she's actually had direct contact with, the council thinks you should be the one assigned to oversee her visit." "Absolutely not," I said, more quickly than I intended. Grace leaned back in her chair, studying me with the patient expression she used whenever she expected an argument. "I understand your hesitation," she said, "but think about what this actually means. The heir to the Cadran throne, coming here, to observe us, to learn from us, rather than the other way around. Do you understand how significant that is? A year ago they saw us as barely worth their attention. Now their future ruler is being sent to study how we live." I did not answer immediately. Part of me wanted to refuse outright, to let someone else deal with the discomfort of standing across from the woman who had once mocked me in front of an entire court. But another part of me, quieter and more curious, wondered what exactly had changed in her since that day, and whether the person arriving would be anything like the one I remembered. "Fine," I said finally. "I'll do it, but I'm not going to pretend that afternoon never happened." "Nobody is asking you to," Grace said. Isora arrived 3 weeks later, accompanied by a small security detail and a single advisor, an older Cadran woman named Mira Solt, who seemed to watch everything around her with careful, measured interest. I met them at the embassy's landing platform, standing beside Grace as the transport descended and its doors opened. Isira stepped out first, and I noticed immediately how different she looked from the young woman I remembered standing on that raised throne. She wore simple traveling clothes rather than the elaborate silver robes from before, and her expression, rather than carrying the cold confidence I remembered, seemed careful, almost guarded, as though she was bracing herself for something. Her eyes found mine almost immediately, and for a long moment neither of us said anything. "Kael Doran," she said finally, her voice quieter than I remembered. "Your Highness," I replied, keeping my tone carefully neutral. "Please," she said, "you do not need to address me that way here. I am not here as royalty. I am here to learn." I did not quite know how to respond to that, so I simply nodded and gestured toward the embassy building behind me. "This way," I said. "We've arranged quarters for you and your advisor." The following weeks were strange in ways I had not fully anticipated. Isira threw herself into the assignment with an intensity that surprised me, asking to visit ordinary human communities rather than staying confined to diplomatic circles, requesting meetings with teachers, farmers, engineers, and artists rather than only politicians and officials. I accompanied her on many of these visits, partly because Grace insisted someone from the delegation stay close to her at all times, and partly, though I did not admit this to myself for some time, because I found myself curious about what she made of everything she saw. We visited a small coastal town where fishing families still worked the waters, using methods passed down through generations, alongside newer technology that helped them navigate more safely. Isira watched an elderly fisherman repair his nets by hand, asking careful questions through a translator about why he did not simply use automated systems for the task. "Because my hands know this work," the old man told her, smiling. "My father taught me, and his father taught him. Some things are worth doing slowly, even when there are faster ways." Isira seemed to turn that idea over in her mind for the rest of the day, quiet and thoughtful in a way I had not expected from the sharp-tongued young woman I remembered from the throne room. We visited a hospital where doctors worked long hours with equipment that would have seemed hopelessly outdated to Cadran medical standards, yet somehow still managed to save lives through sheer determination and careful skill. We visited schools where children argued passionately about ideas far beyond their years, unafraid to challenge their teachers, unafraid to be wrong. "Your children speak to adults as equals," Isira observed one afternoon, as we walked through a university courtyard filled with students debating loudly over some point of philosophy. "Where I come from, a child would never dare question an elder so openly." "We think questioning is how people learn," I said, "even when it's uncomfortable." She glanced at me then, something unreadable passing behind her pale violet eyes. "I am beginning to understand that," she said quietly. Slowly, over the course of those weeks, something shifted between us, though neither of us spoke directly about what had happened in that palace hall so many months before. We settled into an uneasy kind of professional partnership, careful and polite, though the memory of that afternoon remained present in every conversation, unspoken but never fully absent. It was during a visit to a small farming community, nearly a month into her stay, that the subject finally came up directly. We sat together on a wooden porch overlooking fields that stretched toward the horizon, sharing a quiet meal prepared by the family hosting us for the evening. "I have wanted to say something to you," Isira said, breaking the comfortable silence between us. "Since the day I arrived, I did not know how or when would be appropriate. I set down my cup and waited. What I said to you, that day in the hall," she continued, "was cruel, and it was born from ignorance I did not even realize I carried. I had been taught, my entire life, that our empire's age and power made us superior to nearly every species we encountered. I never questioned it, because nobody around me ever questioned it either." "You were 19, I said, though I was not sure if I meant it as an excuse for her or simply an observation. "Old enough to know better," she said. "My father certainly believed so. He was furious with me, not simply because I was unkind, but because I was foolish. I cost our empire an alliance that could have benefited both our peoples, all because I could not resist the chance to feel superior in front of my own court." I studied her for a long moment, watching the last light of the setting sun catch against the pale color of her eyes. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Because I have spent the past month watching your people," she said, "and I have come to understand something I did not understand before. Your species is not measured by how long you have existed among the stars, or how advanced your technology has become. You are measured by how you treat each other, how you care for the ones among you who have less, how you choose to stand firm even when doing so costs you something you want." She paused, looking out over the darkening fields. "You walked away from an empire that day," she said, "not because you believed we had nothing to offer, but because you refused to accept being treated as less than what you are. I did not understand that kind of choice when it happened. I understand it now." I did not know how to respond immediately, so for a while we simply sat together in silence, listening to the sound of wind moving through the fields, the distant call of birds settling in for the evening. "I appreciate you saying that," I said finally. "It couldn't have been easy." "No," she agreed, "it was not." We did not become close friends in the weeks that followed, not exactly, though something between us had clearly softened, a cautious respect building slowly where cold formality had existed before. She continued her observations, filling notebook after notebook with careful accounts of everything she witnessed, and I found myself, almost without noticing, looking forward to our conversations in ways I had not expected. Neither of us could have predicted, as her assigned time on Earth drew toward its end, that the true test of everything she had learned and everything I had chosen to believe about second chances was still waiting somewhere ahead of us, closer than either of us realized. The message arrived in the middle of the night, waking me from sleep with the sharp, insistent tone the embassy reserved only for emergencies. I answered the call still half asleep, and the moment I saw Grace's face on the screen, fully dressed despite the hour, her expression tight with urgency, I knew something serious had happened. "There's been an incident in Cadron space," she said, without any greeting. "A massive solar disturbance hit one of their outer systems 2 days ago. Their main shielding network across 3 settled moons has failed. They're losing power to their life support systems faster than their engineers can repair it." I sat up fully now, pulling my thoughts together. How bad is it? Bad enough that they've reached out to nearly every trading partner they have, requesting emergency assistance, Grace said, including us. I felt a strange, cold weight settle in my stomach. They're asking humanity for help. They're asking everyone for help, Grace corrected. But there's something else you should know. The request came with a specific note attached, asking that you personally be included in any response team we send. Me specifically? I asked. Grace nodded. The request was submitted by Princess Isira Ven. I arrived at the embassy's main briefing room within the hour, still trying to process the scale of what was happening. The images displayed across the room's central screen showed footage from Cadron monitoring stations, 3 moons that had once glittered with city lights, now dimming in patches as backup power systems failed one after another. Millions of people lived across those settlements, and without functioning shields, deadly radiation from the ongoing solar disturbance would soon reach levels the population could not survive. Their technology relies almost entirely on centralized shield generators, explained Noah Bennett, who had joined the briefing still wearing yesterday's clothes, clearly having received the same urgent call I had. When the primary systems failed, they didn't have a strong backup plan because their generators have always been considered nearly impossible to disable. Their engineers are trained to maintain advanced systems, not to improvise solutions when those systems fail completely. And we can help with that. How exactly? Grace asked. Because we've spent our entire history improvising, Noah said. We don't have their level of technology, so we've always had to find creative solutions with limited resources. I've been looking at their shield schematics, what they've shared with us, and I think there's a way to construct temporary shielding using older, simpler methods, layered radiation shielding built from available materials rather than relying on their central generators. Would it work? I asked. It's not elegant, Noah admitted. It's not something their engineers would normally consider because it's crude compared to what they're used to, but it could buy them enough time to properly repair their main systems before the radiation levels become fatal. Grace studied the screen for a long moment before turning to me. The Council wants to send a response team, she said. Engineers, medical staff, whatever resources we can spare, and they specifically want you to lead the human portion of that team, given your existing relationship with the princess. I felt the weight of the moment pressing down on me, memories of that first meeting in the Grand Hall rising unbidden, her words about human fragility, about our short history among the stars, about how little she had once believed we had to offer. I'll go, I said. We arrived in Cadron space less than 3 days later, traveling aboard the fastest transport Earth's fleet could provide, loaded with engineers, medical supplies, and as much raw material as we could gather on short notice. The scene that greeted us as we approached the affected moons was worse than the images had suggested. Entire districts sat dark and silent, evacuation efforts underway across settlements that had never once considered the possibility of losing their advanced systems entirely. Isira met us personally at the main landing platform on the largest of the 3 moons, and the moment I saw her, I barely recognized the composed young woman I had spent weeks getting to know back on Earth. Her hair was disheveled, dark circles shadowed beneath her eyes, and her formal robes had been replaced with simple work clothes, streaked with dust and grime. "Kale," she said, relief clear in her voice, as she crossed the platform toward me. "Thank you for coming." "Of course," I said. "Tell me what's happening." She led us quickly toward the main command center, explaining the situation as we walked. Her father's engineers had been working around the clock, but every attempt to restore the primary shield generators had failed, the damage too extensive, the timeline too short. Radiation levels across the exposed districts were rising steadily, and evacuation shelters, while functional, could not hold the entire population indefinitely. "We have perhaps 4 days," she said, "before the radiation reaches levels our people cannot survive, even within the shelters. My father's engineers believe full repairs could take at least 2 weeks. "That's not a gap we can close by rushing repairs," Noah said, studying data pulled up on a nearby console. "We need something to bridge that time, not a faster fix." "This is where your idea comes in," I said, and Noah nodded, quickly pulling up his design for the layered radiation shielding. The Cadron engineers who gathered around the console reacted with a mixture of confusion and skepticism as Noah explained the concept, using simple materials, industrial metals combined with basic insulating layers, arranged in patterns that could be constructed quickly using equipment already present in their damaged settlements. "This is remarkably crude," one of the senior engineers said, studying the schematics with obvious doubt. "Our systems are designed with far more sophisticated shielding principles." "Your systems were also designed, assuming they would never fail this completely," Noah replied evenly. "This isn't meant to replace your generators. It's meant to keep people alive long enough for you to fix them properly." Isira stepped forward before the discussion could continue further. "We have 4 days," she said firmly. "I would rather try something crude that works than continue relying entirely on a sophisticated system that has already failed us. Begin construction immediately, using every available resource across all 3 moons." The following days blurred together in a haze of exhausting, constant work. Human engineers worked alongside Cadron crews, translating designs, adapting materials, solving problems as they emerged in real time. I spent most of those hours moving between construction sites, coordinating between teams, occasionally standing beside Isira as she oversaw the effort personally, refusing to retreat to safer quarters while her people remained in danger. "You do not need to stay out here with the workers," I told her, during a brief moment of rest on the second night, both of us sitting exhausted against a supply crate near one of the construction sites. "Neither do you," she said. "Yet here you are." I did not have a good response to that, so I simply let the silence settle between us, comfortable despite the exhaustion pressing down on both of us. "I keep thinking about that day in the hall," she said quietly, after a while. "I keep thinking about how easily I dismissed your entire species as beneath consideration, and now here you are, working through exhaustion to save people who once laughed while I mocked you." "That's not why I'm here," I said. "I know," she said. "That is exactly why it matters so much." By the 4th day, as radiation levels crept dangerously close to the threshold Cadron scientists had warned about, the first sections of the improvised shielding came online across the most vulnerable districts. It was not perfect, and it strained under loads it was never elegantly designed to handle, but it held, buying precious time for repair crews to continue their work on the primary generators. I stood beside Isira in the command center as the reading stabilized, watching relief spread across the faces of engineers who had spent days believing failure was the only possible outcome. "For now," I said, "your engineers still need to finish the real repairs. This buys time, nothing more." "Time was all we needed," she said, turning to look at me directly. "Time, and people willing to try something they had never been taught to consider possible." Over the following 10 days, repair crews worked steadily to restore the primary shield generators, protected now by the temporary systems humanity had helped construct. Slowly, district by district, power returned to the settlements, lights flickering back to life across moons that had come dangerously close to losing everything. I did not witness the final restoration myself, having returned briefly to the human transport to coordinate additional supplies. But I heard the celebration from across the platform, cheers rising from crowds gathered to watch their home returned fully to life. Isira found me later that evening, standing quietly on the same platform where she had greeted me upon our arrival, the settlement behind her fully lit once more, glowing softly beneath a clear, star-filled sky. "We could not have done this without your people," she said. "My father wishes to speak with you directly, before your delegation departs." I felt a familiar nervousness settle over me, memories of that grand hall rising again, though this time, I suspected, the conversation waiting for me would be entirely different from the one I had walked away from so many months before. The chamber where King Halvorn Ven received me was far smaller than the grand hall I remembered, a private room lined with old portraits and shelves of physical books that looked as though they had been read many times over the centuries. He stood near a tall window overlooking the settlement below, its lights glowing steadily now across the darkened landscape, and he did not turn immediately when I entered. "Cale Doran," he said finally, turning to face me. He was an older man, his features carrying a weariness that had clearly deepened over the past 2 weeks, though his eyes held something sharp and attentive as he studied me. "I understand our people owe your species a debt that will not be easily repaid. Your engineers did most of the real work, Your Majesty," I said. "We simply offered a different way of thinking about the problem. A different way of thinking that saved millions of lives," he said. "Do not diminish what your people accomplished here out of modesty. I have spent my entire reign believing our empire's age and power made us self-sufficient in ways few other species could match. I have learned over these past 2 weeks exactly how mistaken that belief was." He gestured toward a pair of chairs near the window, and I sat as he lowered himself into the seat across from me, moving with the careful stiffness of someone who had not properly rested in days. "I owe you a personal apology as well," he continued, "though it is not mine to give on behalf of my daughter's words. That apology, I believe, belongs to her alone." "She has already spoken with me about that day," I said, "more than once, in fact." "I am aware," he said. "She has told me everything, about her time on your world, about what she witnessed there, about the conversation you shared on that farm, about everything that has happened between you since. She is not the same young woman who mocked you in my court a year ago." "No," I agreed, "she isn't." The king studied me for a long moment, something thoughtful passing behind his tired eyes. "I would like to propose something," he said, "though I suspect you may need time to consider it fully." "I'm listening," I said. "A formal alliance," he said, "not the one-sided arrangement my court originally proposed, but something built properly, on equal terms, terms negotiated by representatives who understand that respect must flow in both directions. I believe my daughter would be well suited to lead these negotiations from our side, given everything she has learned." I considered this for a moment before responding. "That would need to come from Earth's Council, not from me alone," I said, "but I think, given everything that has happened, they would be willing to listen." "Good," the king said, allowing himself a small, tired smile. "Then perhaps something worthwhile can yet come from all of this." I returned to the platform outside the palace as the last light of evening faded into a clear night sky, filled with more stars than I had ever grown used to seeing, even after months of traveling between systems. Isra was waiting there, as I somehow knew she would be, standing quietly at the edge of the platform, looking out over the settlement that had so nearly been lost. "How did it go?" she asked, as I approached. "Your father wants to propose a real alliance," I said. "One built properly this time." She turned to look at me, something bright and hopeful passing behind her pale eyes. "And what do you think?" she asked. "I think it could work," I said, "if both sides are willing to actually listen to each other this time." She was quiet for a moment, looking back out over the lights below us. "A year ago," she said, "I stood in that hall and told you that your species had nothing worth offering an empire as old and advanced as mine. I believed it completely. I had never once been given a reason to question it. And now? I asked. Now I understand that the things worth measuring in any species have very little to do with how long they have existed or how advanced their technology has become, she said. They have everything to do with how they choose to act when it matters most. Your people did not have to come here. You did not have to help us, not after everything I said to you that day. And yet you came anyway, and you worked until you were exhausted, alongside people who once laughed while I humiliated you. That's not really about you, I said gently. It's about what we believe is right. I know, she said, and something in her voice carried real understanding now, earned rather than simply learned from watching others. That is precisely what makes it matter so much. We stood together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the settlement below slowly return to its normal rhythms, families gathering again in homes that had nearly been lost, children playing in streets that had come dangerously close to becoming uninhabitable. I want to formally apologize, Isira said finally, turning to face me directly. Not simply for what I said that day, though that alone deserves an apology. I want to apologize for everything that assumption represented, the entire way I once viewed your species, and likely many others I have never taken the time to properly understand. Apology accepted, I said, though for what it's worth, I think you've already shown that apology through everything you've done since. She studied me for a long moment, something unreadable passing across her expression. May I ask you something? She said. That day in the hall, when you turned and walked away, were you afraid? Of what it might cost your people? Of how your leaders might react? I considered the question honestly before answering. I was terrified, I admitted. I had no idea if I was making the right choice or ruining everything my delegation had worked toward. But staying and accepting that treatment felt worse than any uncertainty waiting for me outside those doors. I think that is the bravest thing I have ever witnessed, she said quietly. Not simply that you walked away, but that you did it while still afraid, because you believed it mattered more than your own comfort. I did not have a ready response to that, so I simply nodded, and we stood together a while longer, watching the stars above the settlement, both of us quietly aware that something important had shifted between our peoples, built not from an empire's power, but from a single moment when someone had refused to accept less than they deserved. The formal alliance between Earth and the Cadran Empire was signed 3 months later, in a ceremony held not in the grand hall where I had once been mocked, but in a smaller, quieter chamber, attended by representatives from both worlds who had actually taken the time to understand each other properly first. Isira led the negotiations personally, exactly as her father had proposed, and I watched with quiet pride as she guided discussions with a fairness and thoughtfulness that would have been unimaginable from the sharp-tongued young princess I had first encountered over a year earlier. The terms reached were balanced, built on genuine respect rather than assumption, a foundation neither side would need to walk away from. News of the alliance spread quickly across the region, carried by the same networks that had once spread stories of a human walking out of a royal court in anger. This time, the story told was different, one of two peoples who had found their way from misunderstanding toward genuine partnership, built through humility, hard work, and a willingness on both sides to learn from mistakes rather than simply defend them. I stood at the edge of that final ceremony, watching Isira and Grace exchange formal signatures under the soft light of the chamber, and I thought back often, in quiet moments over the following years, to that ordinary afternoon when I had turned and walked away from an empire, uncertain of everything except that I would not accept being treated as less than what I was. I never could have predicted, standing in that grand hall with my hands trembling and my pride wounded, that the same young woman who had mocked me so easily would one day stand beside me as a genuine partner, having learned, through hard experience, that true strength lies not in how loudly one can dismiss another, but in how honestly one is willing to grow. Years later, when people ask me about that famous story, the one about the human who turned and departed from the Cadran royal court, I would tell them the truth, that walking away had never been about anger or pride alone. It had been about believing, even in an uncertain moment, that respect was worth more than any deal, and that sometimes the smallest choices, made quietly and without any expectation of reward, are the ones that end up changing everything that follows. And somewhere among the stars, on evenings when the twin suns set over a palace that had once dismissed an entire species without a second thought, a princess who had learned humility the hard way would look out over settlements saved by unexpected friendship and remember exactly how far a single moment of courage could travel, carrying two very different worlds closer together than either had ever imagined possible.